Hi everyone, the assembly line of great films just doesn't stop as we lead up to the 2018 Oscars. And today I'm going to talk about Joe Wright's latest film, Darkest Hour. And as usual, I'm going to tell you whether it's worth seeing. Hint, with all these Oscar films, they're nearly always worth seeing for some reason. And then I'm going to take you through some aspects of the film and then we'll have spoilers. So this is Joe Wright's film. He's often dealt with these big theatrical kind of themes. He even went over some of this material in his film Atonement. He likes history. He's got a background in the theatre, and we'll talk about that later because it is one of the qualities or issues, depending on your point of view, of this film. So let's cut to it. Is this worth seeing? It's definitely worth seeing. And the reason I say that is it's just a historically important period. And so it's interesting to see this film. But the main reason that you probably should see it, and most filmgoers will see it, is Gary Oldman's performance as Winston Churchill, favourite for Best Actor at the Academy Awards. And, really, if you know Gary Oldman, he's had some great performances, and this will be really matching up to those earlier ones, and certainly his best for quite a while. The other thing I wanted to point out is look, I don't know, this may be a known thing, but I was thinking about the film and I actually did some research, and it's what I call a Matryoshka film. And what I mean by that is, you know those Russian dolls where the dolls fit in each other? That's called a Matryoshka doll. So in this film, it's all about Churchill deciding what to do as he faces the threat of Hitler to the United Kingdom. And at 1 hour and 36 minutes, no spoiler here, they talk about Dunkirk. And you could do a Matryoshka film, which is at 1 hour 30, you could just put Christopher Nolan's Dunkirk on, play it right to the end, and then go back to Darkest Hour. It would all be seamless. That's my contribution to modern film commentary. Okay, I'm going to get back in a second and we'll really dive into this interesting film. Okay, so let's dive into it. So I'm not a big fan of Joe Wright as a director. He's got a theatrical background, and I find that his films are very much almost like filmed plays, like Atonement, apart from the Dunkirk scene, ironically. And Hannah is probably the film of his that I enjoyed the most. Now, this film I think is a really good film, and we'll talk about a bit later why that is, but Joe Wright's direction in this is a little bit more interesting, but it's still very much from that theatrical world. But because really this is just a series of scenes which are two-handers, really it's just one actor talking to another actor or a group of actors in a meeting. It's not really any flashy camera work. There's some really interesting cinema lighting that he uses, which we'll talk about, but that's about the only directorial flourish. I guess the big mark for him is he gets some great performances, and that leads us straight into the performance of Gary Oldman as Winston Churchill. Now, Gary Oldman has been a great actor for a long time. If you think back, he burst onto the scene with Sid and Nancy, and then he's just had numerous really good roles. And he kind of disappeared for a little while, and then he came back and he got like the Batman films and such like. So he kind of reinvented himself as more this senior actor of the world. And if you needed a guy who could play an old American or an old Englishman, you'd go to Gary Oldman. But this is a transformation. It's famous if you see any pictures of him, how he had to have 3 hours of makeup a day to look like the corpulent Winston Churchill. He had to work on that voice, because we always think of Winston Churchill as this great orator, but in reality, all the people who worked around him said it was very hard to understand Winston Churchill because of the way he would mumble, and his brain was always going 1,000 miles an hour, so you weren't quite sure of the connections. So Gary Oldman nails both the interior life of Winston Churchill, who we know was at least a depressive, if not maybe even bipolar, in that he would go up, 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 and then down, down, down. And what I liked about his performance was there was a very clear delineation between the private life of Churchill and the public life. And in private, he is quite nervous, agitated. You can see him editing his works, and it isn't just pouring out as a work of genius. He's really trying to distill his thoughts. Then in public, he is all confidence and is able to go through this maze of politics and world history, and Oldman really delivers. Now, the rest of the cast is very good, although I don't think as great. And I think a part of that is they just get blown away by Gary Oldman. So you have Lily James as Elizabeth Layton, who was famously his secretary and had to put up with all manner of shenanigans. You have Kristen Scott Thomas as Clementine Churchill, who is also a famous personality, being married to Winston Churchill. And then the great Ben Mendelsohn steps in as King George VI. And Ben Mendelsohn is the only person who I think in this film can match with Gary Oldman. And they're the best scenes in the film, are just Oldman and Mendelsohn. So as I said, Joe Wright directs this very theatrically, and what I do love about it is it's called The Darkest Hour, and from the first scene opens up in Parliament, and they're fighting to see who will be the leader, because Chamberlain, who has appeased Hitler, has to go politically, and they're trying to work out who will be the next leader. And it opens up and it is all dark with just these plumes of light coming down, and it's very akin to a work of Rembrandt. Like, the lighting is just enough so that you catch the faces, but all the faces are clothed in confusion. They're not sure what to do, and it's beautifully lit. And he uses that motif throughout the whole film, and I thought that really, really worked well. Even though I wasn't so happy with some of the other scenes. Look, the main theme of this film, there's a technical theme and then there's a narrative theme. And the narrative theme is that at certain times, no matter what the war capacity or the ability to inflict violence on other nations there is, humanity has a very great ability to be able to steer away from that or through that by using language. And we all know that Winston Churchill is just famous for the speeches he made during World War II and for his series of books after, the history of the English language. And what this shows is his ability to galvanize a nation which was conflicted. There was a lot of people who really thought the better way was to appease Hitler and try and buy out a solution. And even worse, considering that the royal family were all related to the German royal family and to the Russian, that perhaps being of Aryan stock, being a white nation, that they would not be treated badly, and maybe even this is the proper path. So Churchill, who had been talking against Hitler for 10 years, who hated fascism with every bone of his body, galvanizes, weaponizes the English language, and in doing so, changes the course of history. This is a really interesting film. It's another Trump film, because it's all about you must fight tyranny, that there must be transparency when you can. It's very interesting these times. You can imagine this will be, people will come back to the late 2018s, 2017s, 2016, the same way we went to sci-fi films in the 50s and, were able to tease out that really what they were talking about was the Cold War. That's going to happen with all these movies now. I'm going to come back in a second and we'll go into spoilers. Okay, so this again there's no spoilers per se. I think we all know what happened in World War II. Even people who aren't into history know that Churchill turns the tide. England, the United Kingdom, stands against Hitler. They're really the only power left in Europe till Russia really enters the war towards the end. And of course, in 41, America enters the war and then it all changes. But at that time, when this movie is set, they're basically by themselves and isolated. And if it wasn't for Churchill, really history would have changed. So what Joe Wright has to do, and what is very interesting is, and I've read some interviews with Joe Wright, is that he talks about emotional truth versus factual truth. Now, normally this would just be an interesting discussion amongst, people who are into movies or literature. But this has got an actual real bearing on this film, because there are scenes in this film which did not happen, and he has changed the way in which Churchill is represented because he sees it as serving the emotional truth. So there's two very big scenes in this film which I think are worth just the entrance price alone. Now, one is Churchill disappears and he from an official car, and he goes into the Tube, which is the London Underground, and he talks to regular, Londoners about what he should do. Should he appease Hitler or should we fight? And it's a really uplifting scene. It's a real St. Crispin's Day, Henry V kind of speech. Not speech so much, but the way that everyone rouses. And it's kind of put that this changes his opinion, and he goes back and stands really boldly against Parliament and convinces them that this is the path. So, of course, that never happened. But Churchill did often disappear, and there are known stories of him, talking to punters in the London streets, but that scene per se never happened. And yet it's really the emotional cornerstone. Now, the other great scene is Ben Mendelsohn, as the king, comes and visits Winston Churchill late at night, and just when Churchill is wavering and is not sure what to do, is he up to this? And he says, "You have all my support." Now, it is true that Churchill and the king developed this incredible tight bond, and really were able to guide each other during the war. But that scene, that never happened. That conversation never even happened. And yet, it's the best scene in the whole film. So, what do you do about that? It's very interesting because Joe Wright changes a lot of stuff which you kind of think you didn't really need to change. So, for instance, the secretary, Elizabeth Lake, she didn't start working for him for another year. But for some reason, she is really quite famously his secretary because she survived the war. And by the way, she didn't have a brother at Dunkirk. And she wrote a famous book about working for him. So I guess they thought that people would know her. So, there's these weird things where Joe Wright is making these choices. The king and Churchill had lunch every Tuesday. For some reason, they make it a Monday. Like, why would you do that? I don't understand. At the end of the film, it says, and then Churchill gets dumped in 45, and everyone goes, "Oh, why did they dump this great leader?" But they don't have that he got re-elected in 51. Like, it's just these little things. Joe Wright's really making these little choices, thinking that it serves the story better. And some of them I get, because as I said, the best two scenes aren't real. But they really make the movie work. But some of these others, I don't know if they were necessary. So it's very interesting the way Joe Wright has attacked this material. I think this is a really good film. I don't think it's a great film. I think Gary Oldman's great, and I think you could make a very good argument that the film as an entity suffers because it's all about Gary Oldman. And really, this is that classic British Oscar film where actually the narrative probably suffers because you get this great performance. And yeah, I mean, look, it's definitely worth seeing it. And if you don't know too much about history, or you do know a lot about history, I think it's interesting to just see how they portray this 1 month in 1940. That's it for today. As I said, more Oscar films coming. As I said, I'm set in Australia and we sometimes don't get the films for a while. So I've got 2 big ones still to come, The Phantom Thread and Lady Bird. And I'm hoping they'll be out pretty soon. So that's it for today. If you like what I'm doing, subscribe, hit the bell, and then you'll always know when I've got a new review up. And finally, I'm on Twitter at Guru Eden. I'll see you later. Bye.